All right, let's start then. I want to briefly, so I already introduced myself. There we go. So I'm a research associate here at CRASSH, and specifically I work on the project called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the social impact of artificially intelligent communications technology. And we've been around since 2018 now. We'll continue until next year. And we are based in the Center for the Humanities and Social Change, which is grouped under CRASSH. A bit more about the background. What have I done so far? What have we as a project done so far? So we are primarily interested in the ethics of language-based AI. So we've looked at harmful content on social media, specifically hate speech and disinformation. We've worked on counter-speech, also gender bias in machine translation systems, and we've worked on making data sets more transparent. Maybe a bit more about my personal background. So I'm a linguist by training, and I'm particularly interested in any forms of abuse of language, specifically in socio-political contexts, in moments of conflict and crisis. I've worked on public discourse on revolutions such as the Arab Spring, as well as media representations of refugees, and I'm also quite interested in any forms of gender-based linguistic violence. So just so that you have an idea who I am, what my background is. Okay, and what I want to talk about mostly in this talk today are basically two main questions. One is I want to look at what the role currently is in the increasing polarization of politics and society. So how do modern day algorithms feed into that and increase polarization? But then I also want to take a step back and look at the question, how can we actually use these technologies and algorithms to maybe stop polarization and to facilitate depolarization of online conversations. And before I continue, I want to just mention a brief content warning. I will be showing examples of hate speech, so just that you know what to expect. All right, so I like to begin personally with defining or some definitions. So what do I actually mean when I say polarization? What does polarization mean in the context of my approach in this presentation particularly? So basically we distinguish, or the literature distinguishes between two main types of polarization. Ideological polarization on the one hand, and what is called affective polarization on the other hand. So ideological polarization basically defines the fact that different political groups of people have different political views. We all have different worldviews, different belief systems. And then affective polarization basically refers to when these differences come into effect, essentially. So when different groups of people, especially in politics, start distrusting each other. So unfortunately, we can see that currently in America, increasingly that different political parties more and more distrust each other. And then I want to look at more specifically how can we understand polarization specifically in the context of technologies. And I found this quote quite useful by Jacob Lefton, who is technology and design lead of a non-profit organization called Build Up, and they work on specifically developing social bots to facilitate peace building. So I'm just briefly read out the quote. What polarization is as a phenomenon is that groups of people are separating from each other and building stereotypes of the other groups of people, and losing shared facts and losing shared language to talk about the issues. And it doesn't matter if one side is right or wrong in this if there can't be a healthy civic conversation. So I found this a really good summary and description of polarization and what it means in the day and age of social media and technology. So we have the continued separation of people, And notably, this separation is visible in language and communication, how people talk to each other or not talk to each other. We lose the ability to effectively communicate. And this is exacerbated by modern technologies. So this is basically, these are the key points that I would like to focus on. And a big problem, unfortunately, is that we don't have a shared definition of polarization. And that makes it really difficult, especially when analyzing social media analysis. And every single study you look at, they have a different definition of polarization. So that makes it very difficult to reach a universal approach and understanding of it. And the same is true for the next example, and that is hate speech in particular. So there is no universal definition of hate speech. The most common understanding is that, first of all, we define harmful content as any kind of content that potentially incites violence or aggression against a specific person or group of people. And we talk about hate speech specifically if that aggression or hatred is based on a specific characteristic, like religion, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, age, disability, and so on. But yeah, again, we don't have a universal understanding of this. Every social media platform has different guidelines, what they include as protected characteristics. Yep. Characteristics, apologies. Yes, and then misinformation and disinformation are maybe a bit clearer. So when it can really be said that information is false, we speak of false information, and then we distinguish, has the information been shared intentionally, knowing that it is false, or was it an accident, basically. So with no intended harm, we speak about misinformation. With the intention to cause harm, we speak about disinformation. So the first question I want to then continue to address is, how does artificial intelligence actually facilitate polarization? So this is probably no news to you. We can all witness that polarization is rising, is increasing, and we have seen a continuous shift of dialogue, of conversations to online spaces. So of course this is also increasingly where polarization takes place. And at the same time we can observe an increasing level of toxic content and toxic conversations that lead further to segregating people. And this, in most cases, has to do with essentially with the design of social media platforms. So we have feed algorithms that create so-called echo chambers and filter bubbles. So creating more and more of these homogeneous groups where we are not confronted with any kind of new or different perspectives and viewpoints. So just a little bit more about echo chambers, feed algorithms, filter bubbles. How do they actually play into this? So we know that spaces, in this context, digital spaces, they shape our behavior, they direct our behavior. And of course, algorithms, if you use Instagram or TikTok or Twitter, they are designed that we see more of what we like. We see more of what we already looked at. So in a way that is nice and kind of easy, because it protects us from the overwhelming massive information, but it also severely limits our choices and what we see, and that can potentially be dangerous, because it also leads to us existing in these isolated bubbles where we only communicate with like-minded people. So as I said before, a very homogeneous space. We don't get into contact with a lot of other views. So that is essentially what can then become dangerous. So a little bit more about two of probably the biggest problems that are currently driving polarization increasingly and dividing people. are hate speech and disinformation, and I want to specifically focus on hate speech. And sadly, we do have a number of research studies now that show that being exposed to hate speech online regularly does have psychological trauma, and it can actually lead to people being physically harmed. So a very recent study, for example, has shown or has identified a direct relation between the direct exposure to hate speech among, specifically, these were Ukrainian migrants in Poland who've been repeatedly exposed to hate speech, and there has been a direct link has been identified between that exposure and them developing mental health problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Other studies have also shown that it is pervasive across geographical and socioeconomic boundaries. There have been documented cases where hate speech has actually led to concrete violent acts against marginalized groups. It normalizes intolerance towards people with protected characteristics. It promotes extremism. And sadly, we also have empirical evidence that shows that there is a connection between hate speech online and children being bullied and adolescents being bullied in school. So the question is, what are social media companies doing about this? Not very much. So they seem quite reluctant to address these problems properly. So we know, thanks to documents that were leaked by Frances Haugen, I think 2 years ago now, or almost 2 years ago, that they know at Facebook that they only address a very small percentage of actual hateful content on their platform. And similarly, with the start of the Russian attack on Ukraine last year, the Center for Countering Digital Hate identified that Facebook was actually failing to label 91% of posts that contained Russian propaganda. So, and we can assume they're aware of the problem, but I guess it's a little bit, like, to some extent, part of the business model, I suppose. Yes, I want to just take a very brief look at one of these examples in more detail, because it is also a very immediate or recent topic, and has been a very recent topic for decades, sadly, and that is refugees, how they're talked about in public discourse, and by public discourse I mean traditional media, political discourse, and also social media discourse, and why it matters that actually how we talk about these topics, and also how the media talks about these topics, matters and affects how people perceive, or like general social media users perceive these subjects and these people. And for example, there are many studies that show on social media that we can observe an increasing number of offensive language, hate speech, and even concrete calls for violence against refugees or migrants. This is mostly in a European context, I should say. And along with that, we can also see globally, and within Europe specifically, a rise of populist governments that actually kind of add to this overall narrative of people being unwanted. So there's like a frequent demonization of refugees that leads to an increase of hate speech and then polarization. So there's this recurring narrative that probably you've all seen of refugees or migrants being the others, us versus them, has been identified, especially in media discourse, for a very long time, and you always see the same kind of dichotomies, like bad versus good people, us the people versus the enemy. And what it does, it increasingly just creates fear and anxiety and uncertainty amongst people. And I like this quote by Romero Rodriguez, who said, continuous exposure to demonization generates polarization. So it does matter how we talk about refugees, migrants in public discourse. And especially in the UK context, I would say, at least since the David Cameron government, there has been a recurring language in political discourse, often referring to people as natural disasters or as people invading the country. And we see these kind of distinctions between genuine and economic or bogus migrants, deserving and undeserving people. So this distinction, grouping people together, even using words like parasites, leeches, and scroungers. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it kind of creates this idea that people are burdening the country. They're invading the country and they're burdening us. And so it has been found that constantly being exposed to this kind of very derogatory, very demonizing type of language by the media, by politicians, it only increases radicalization amongst citizens, amongst the general public, and it deteriorates intergroup relations. So it just makes us more skeptical, I suppose, of one another. Yes, and I wanted to just take this very brief detour to show that there is a strong connection, of course, between how politics, how the media talk about things, how that is then transferred into social media. It is all interconnected and drives how we see each other and drives polarization. But there are also some good news and some not so bad, terrible findings. So there are actually some studies that have found, for example, that, of course, the amount of information we can find on social media is much more diverse, and we see more diverse or hear more diverse voices on social media than we would traditionally see in the media, in media sources. And there are some studies that even have found some depolarizing effects of social media. So particularly when very personal stories and experiences are involved, it actually tends to affect people in a positive way. I'm going to come back to that element a bit later in the talk. Or when we appeal to people's understanding of social norms, that can actually help depolarize conversations. All right, so on to the second question, which is how can we then, so we've looked at how artificial intelligence, how algorithms facilitate polarization, but now I'm going to address the question, can we actually use these technologies to kind of do the opposite, to depolarize conversations? For that, for any of you who is already familiar with that, I apologize, but I just want to briefly introduce the term or the field that is natural language processing, because that is essentially, that makes all of this possible. And that is a subfield of linguistics and AI or computer science, where we use computational methods to process, to generate, to analyze large amounts of human language, natural human language data. And we use this, you probably use this on a daily basis for things like grammar correction on your phones, harm prediction in emails, fake news detections, or when you're talking, if you're talking to Alexa or Siri, that is the basic. And it is also extremely important for automatic hate speech detection. And then basically as subfields of these kinds of things, what is extremely helpful are sentiment and network analysis. So sentiment analysis can also be extremely beneficial or useful, I guess, for marketing purposes. So if you can program an algorithm to learn about a user's interests and their opinions, you can let them know about very tailored events that will spark their interest. So on the one hand, learning about what people are interested in, what their opinions are, what their emotions are, what their attitudes are. And on the other hand, and this is particularly interesting or important when we look at identifying hateful comments and like hateful networks on social media, for example, in relation to terrorism and extremism, to actually analyze, to be able to analyze the networks of individual users. So if you can identify, for example, on Twitter or Facebook, who a person interacts with, whose posts they like, whose posts or the people that the events that they attend or that they like online, we can learn a lot more about the wider network of people. Yes, and this is, I mean, relevant for a large number of areas, such as the social sciences, marketing, finance, political science, and so on. So I now want to just go through, very briefly, through different methods and different approaches that we can use in order to kind of fight online hate speech and fight or stop, decrease online polarization. That is digital nudging and the redirect method. Then I'm going to talk briefly about a method that a colleague and myself have developed that is quarantining hate speech. Then I'm going to talk briefly about counter-narratives or counter-speech and how we can use that. And then that basically combined with the topic of chatbots and social bots. So digital nudging or redirecting people is not necessarily new. That is used quite a lot for commercial purposes. So if you've ever, when you're shopping online and you see a button popping up saying put in basket, then you're basically being gently nudged to buy the item, ideally as quickly as possible. So it's a very persuasive method that is supposed to like nudge you to make a good decision. It's debatable what good is in that context, but to make a quick and good decision. But it can also be used in order to direct people into maybe away from potentially dangerous content and towards safer content. So this is related to what has been called the redirect method, and we, for example, have seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Meta actually used that on its social media platforms. So when people were searching for maybe vaccine information, you were directed towards the World Health Organization and away from potentially dubious content, away from conspiracy theories. So that was, I think, I don't know when exactly that was implemented, but when they started noticing, okay, more and more people are going or taking the wrong turn on social media platforms, they implemented this method. And equally, the Internet Watch Foundation has used something quite similar, where they're using a chatbot to redirect people on websites to basically stop them from accessing sexual content that involves children. So this, if used in the right way with good intentions, this can be an extremely useful and powerful method. Okay, so back to how social media companies currently basically react to online hate speech. You might have done that yourself. You saw a post that you thought was very inappropriate and you reported it maybe. So that is usually what is necessary. Someone reports a comment, and if it violates the company's guidelines, basically, their policies, then the post might get taken down, might get deleted. that unfortunately means that still a lot of humans have to do this work because algorithms are not, like, counter to what companies might want you to believe, but they're not good enough to actually correctly detect most of problematic content. So this is still actually done by humans, which is a whole problem in itself. But yeah, basically this is very much a reactive approach based on censorship and blocking and deleting, which upsets a lot of people. So what my colleague Marcus Tommelin and I thought would be a better approach was to develop a system like an app or a browser extension that allows people to protect themselves. So this is independent of the social media platform. But you can basically run the application, for example, and it will detect. It is based on a very general automatic hate speech detection algorithm, and it identifies a potentially offensive post and it puts it in a quarantine, much like, you know, an antivirus system on your computer. And it then warns you as a user that this post might contain hate speech, and then you can decide if you want to see it or not. Like, you might recognize the sender's name, it might just be a joke, then you know, okay, it's safe, I look at the message anyways. But you can also choose to just ignore it. And at the same time, it would warn you if you yourself compose a message that might potentially be dangerous. So you can see down here, these two are actually screenshots of the application. So it would give you this nice indication from green to red of how it will give you a percentage of how hateful or harmful a post is, either one that you are about to receive or one that you have composed yourself. And then you can basically decide if you want to read it or post it anyways or not. So this is something that just, it adds an additional layer, so it protects users in the sense that you are not immediately confronted with a potentially hateful comment. So it adds additional friction, which is not a very popular topic in the general field, because you always want everything to work as fast as possible. But in this case, actually adding more friction actually helps or would help to protect people. So as I said, an engineering student actually developed this application for us. This could also work in the form of a browser extension that you can just run yourself. Okay, related, we're sticking to hate speech. Another really good approach is counter-speech. So counter-speech basically is any kind of direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. This is the definition provided by the Dangerous Speech Project. And the idea of counter-speech is to not, that a post doesn't have to be deleted, but that other people, ideally, step in and produce some kind of speech that that is good, that is better than the original harmful message. And the idea is mostly to reach what are called cyber bystanders. So people who are following the conversation, especially people who might be on the brink of maybe posting something harmful themselves. But then if someone actually jumps in and says, oh, this is not okay, then ideally those people can be stopped. And research, for example, has shown that it increases, so if someone produces counter-speech, it generally it produces more positive responses then by other people as well. It has also been, interestingly, it has been found that the identity and the social status of whoever produces the counter-speech can be very, very important and can be the key to making it more successful. And it has been found that especially counter-speech that appeals to people's empathy can actually reduce for example, racist hate speech. Here's some real life examples. So you can see that there are also very different types of counter speech. As much as there are different types of hate speech, there are different ways of countering it. So, for example, here, using language like this is just unnecessarily hurtful towards immigrants, making someone aware your post is not okay, that it is wrong to say that. So pointing out that something is actually harmful. Or on the right-hand side, which is actually a meme, so we have image and text combined, and a bit more humorous, if you like, that can work in some contexts. And the bottom one, remember that those you care about can see this post too. So that is also quite a good counter-speech technique to just remember people that, you know, this might be an online space, but you still have an offline life, and you might not want your boss to see, for example, that you're insulting people on the internet. So, warning people of actual consequences. And this is also where stories can come in again, because some of the most effective forms of speech, or specifically counter-speech, are, as I said before, personal and emotional stories. So, for example, in the context of refugees, it might actually change someone's opinion if they see someone's very personal story on social media and can empathize with people and what they have to go through. So storytelling in that context can be very effective. It has also been found, for example, that it directly affects the brain. It affects our amygdala. It appeals to our emotions and our levels of empathy. And this could potentially be combined with conversational AI. So I have to admit, at this point, I would say conversational AI maybe isn't quite there yet to really produce, let's say, good examples of storytelling. But maybe in combination with something like the redirect method, you could purposefully direct people to maybe look at a short but emotional story about a person's life that makes people more empathetic. Yeah, so again, a quote from one of the research studies on this, that says, "We find that sharing personal experiences about a political issue, especially experiences involving harm, help to foster respect via increased perceptions of rationality." So this, I think, is an interesting avenue that could be taken in the future, along with conversational AI, hopefully improving more and more in the next years. Okay, and then I want to basically close off with something that we've worked on ourselves as well, and that is basically to think about chatbots and how we can improve a chatbot producing counter-speech. So I've included some headlines that came out last year in response to Meta's new AI chatbot that very quickly produced racist speech itself. So of course this isn't ideal. So ideally a dialogue system or a chatbot would actually know how to respond appropriately to examples of hate speech. So basically the question is, first of all, of course, how should a chatbot or an automated dialogue system respond to something? And I included an example of hate speech here. That you can probably all read for yourself. I don't need to read that out. And something that Meta's chatbot, for example, how respond to this kind of question or claim would be this. Whoops, that's not something I know much about. Tell me about some of your hobbies. Which is, I think we can all agree, a very, very bad response to a hateful comment like that. And this will be another option to respond. Jews are human beings with human rights. They have every right to live their life as they wish. That is just one example. But it will be a better approach and a better counter narrative. And this is from actually what the system that we worked on produced as a counter response. I can maybe put the link in the chat later on, so you can actually go to the website yourself and test it out, and that will actually help improve the system if you test it. So yes, how did we actually approach this? So it is now agreed on that counter speech can be an effective way of responding to hate speech. The UN has guidelines on how to use counter speech. Facebook even encourages its users to use counter speech and provides directions on how to do that. But fully automating counter speech is still quite a tricky task, and that is mostly because of the data, the training and test data that is available to train the algorithm, to train the system. One of the really good data sets is the multi-Conan data set that has about 5,000 hate speech and counter speech pairs, and the counter speech responses were actually produced by professionals, so experts who work in this area on a daily basis. So you actually get really good responses, but it is also, as I mentioned before, there are different types of counter speech, as there are different types of hate speech. So one key thing is also learning, and that includes the system as well, what is an appropriate response to a hateful comment. So like the one you see here, if you respond with something like, "You are very stupid and dumb to speak negatively about Muslims, hell is where you belong," that is not going to be very effective, that's not going to be very successful. But if you actually respond with something like, "The world would be actually a very dark place without Muslims who contribute a lot to our society," and so on, that is a much better counter response, but also produced by NGO operators. So this is one of the very few really good data sets, but it is extremely difficult to, of course, curate these data sets because you cannot simply just scrape data from the internet. Yeah, as I mentioned, a really important question that humans have to learn to decide, but of course the algorithm also has to learn how to recognize or evaluate what actually good counter speech is. And so there are 4 basic criteria. One is fluency, so of course you want the sentence to actually be grammatically correct and like a cohesive sentence. You don't want it to be toxic, so the example in red that I read out would be a very bad example. So you don't actually want to respond with more hate speech. Gold similarity, so basically that is the gold standard. You want the automated counter speech to be as close to a response created by a human as possible, and not just ideally an expert human in this context. And then diversity, as I already mentioned, so you should refrain from saying something like "this goes against the community guidelines," but you want to be a bit more specific to the type of insult that was uttered in the first place. Okay, so as I said, we worked on the system to basically improve it. It is not possible at all without any human involvement in the development process. And the best approach, and the approach that we took, was to take an already existing dialogue system that works really well for general purposes. So you can have a good superficial, I would say, conversation with the chatbot, but of course it wasn't trained for a specific purpose. So you use a very broadly trained chatbot like Diallo GPT by Microsoft, and you fine-tune it with a more specific data set, in this case, the multi-Conan data set that I talked about earlier. Yes, and then you basically retrain a you retrain a system to be able to respond more specifically and better to hateful utterances. And so you can actually see on the right-hand side, these are the basically what we did in the end was we gave sample responses to a set of human evaluators who then decided how good the counter-speech responses were. And here you can basically see the results. So the most common ratings were between 3 and 4 compared to, so these are the system-generated responses compared to the NGO operator responses. You see that it spreads out a bit more broadly, a bit more widely. There are more cases of responses that received a lower rating, but also a comparatively good number of responses that received like a 3-4 point rating out of a 5-point rating. And we compared it to an already existing system that works quite similarly, and we could notice that our system was improved in terms of fluency, so it produced more fluent responses, less toxic responses, and it was quite close to human responses. Something that systems still struggle with quite a lot is diversity, so finding appropriate responses depending on what type of hate speech we're dealing with. All right, and following that, an idea basically maybe to avoid the problem of full automation, which still relies on a lot of manual work, annotating the actual data. It still struggles quite a bit with identifying all the wide range of communicative strategies, and as I said earlier, it still struggles with finding appropriate and relevant responses. So one idea would be to kind of use a semi-automated system, and colleagues have already developed a sample platform specifically designed for NGOs to produce counter-speech against Islamophobic comments. So basically the system can help provide possible counter-speech responses, but the human would still make the decision. So it's basically like prompting, the idea is to prompt counter-speech responses, but it would still be up to the human to decide, is this appropriate? Maybe use the ideas, the suggestions as a starting point, and then formulate their own counter-speech responses. So the idea is also that this would help people, just average social media users, to overcome this hurdle of like taking the step and actually speaking up if they have witnessed harmful speech or behavior online. Okay, so to finish this presentation, I just want to basically summarize some of the challenges that still remain and some future considerations. So we definitely still need more studies on techniques and how effective different techniques are. We need to talk about improving definitions, so ideally come up with more sound and more universal definitions of things like hate speech and polarization. Algorithms need to be more adaptive, so they need to be able to adapt to content that constantly changes. We need more preventative methods, so as I said before, how hate speech is currently addressed is simply reactive, and we need different solutions for that. And I guess a very important question that I don't really have the answer to, but of course, who actually decides what is right or wrong content? So who do we want to make these decisions? Governments, companies, users? So yeah. That is basically it. Before I finish, I just want to direct your attention while you're here to an event that my team is organizing and that is taking place in this building next Thursday. So if you're interested in AI and ethics and how to teach AI ethics to especially students in engineering and computer science, it's free. So please do join us if you're interested. All right, thank you very much.